The smell of chalk dust always lingered in the air, mingling with the faint metallic temps of ink. Even before the first lesson began, that scent settled into your clothes, into your hair, as though the very walls of the school exhaled it. The classroom was already alive with a restless energy when the door creaked open and a stream of children hurried inside, each clutching their battered exercise books. The clatter of wooden chairs against scuffed parquet floors rang out, softened only by the low hiss of the old radiators that ticked and gurgled in protest against the cold. It was the early 1970s, and the world outside was shifting, fast Beatles records spinning in living rooms, flared trousers appearing on high streets, but inside the school, tradition held tight. Each desk bore its own inkwell, a little ceramic pot of royal blue liquid set into a groove, waiting patiently for nib pens to dip and scratch their way across pale-lined paper. There was something ceremonial about it. The dipping, the careful shake against a rim, the attempt to draw a line without blotting. Of course, the blots came anyway. Fingers stained blue, cuffs dotted with inky shadows, smudges that spread like little accidents you couldn't quite undo. The teacher's chalk tapped sharply against the blackboard. Mr. Edwards, with his tweed jacket and slightly crooked tie, commanded the room without ever needing to raise his voice. He drew neat, deliberate letters, the chalk squeaking faintly as he formed them, dust gathering on his fingertips. Behind him, a row of maps curled at the edge of syrup, the Commonwealth, the outline of Britain itself, and beside them, a poster reminding children to mind their manners. He turned then, surveying the room through his wire-framed spectacles. "Neatness," he said, not loudly, but with enough weight to still the whispering. "Neatness is a reflection of discipline." The children bent their heads lower, pens scratching in uneven rhythm, the sound like 100 tiny insects chewing their way through the morning. At the far end, a boy named David sat hunched, his tongue poking out as he tried to keep the ink from blotting. But the nib, too sharp from overuse, caught against the paper. A dark blot spread instantly, blooming like a bruise. He froze, staring at it. The girl beside him, Anna, glanced over and gave the faintest smile, as if to say she knew the struggle too. Without a word, she slid her blotting paper across to him. Their eyes met briefly, just a flicker, but it was enough to soften the moment. He whispered a thank you, barely audible, before pressing the blotter down and watching the stain dull to a pale, forgiving smudge. The lesson carried on. Arithmetic problems, lines of long division, numbers marching in chalked order across the board. Yet, all the while, the ink told its own story. The smears where hands brushed against drying words, the faint fingerprints left behind on exercise book covers, the way a single, careless flick could leave a trail across a desk. These marks became part of the memory of the classroom, tiny relics of effort and error mingling together. By late morning, the sunlight managed to break through the high windows, casting pale rectangles across the desks. Dust motes danced in the beams, swirling lazily. Whenever someone shifted in their seat, you could hear the building's age in the groan of its beams, the distant slam of a door echoing down stone corridors, the muted murmur of another class reciting times tables in unison. The rhythm of the school was everywhere steady and familiar, yet within it were these private, fragile moments, the nervous glance before a teacher checked your sums, the quiet pride of a line written smoothly without smudged the brush of hands when two children reached for the same ink bottle. During break, the pens were left resting in grooves, nibs still wet, waiting. Some children ran to the yard, eager for a breath of sharp winter air, while others lingered, waving blotting paper to dry their pages faster. In those few minutes of freedom, the room smelled different, less of ink, more of woolen coats and the faint tank of toffee wrappers pulled from pockets. But soon the bell clanged again, its metallic ring vibrating through the building, and the ink would once more take center stage. There was a curious dignity to the ritual, though none of the children thought of it that way then. Years later, people would talk about those stains on their cuffs, the way their fingertips were always tinted blue, and laugh with nostalgia. In that moment, though, it was simply the rhythm of learning. Dip, write, blot, repeat. A rhythm that stitched together mornings in cold classrooms, winters when radiators struggled, and the ever-present hum of discipline wrapped in the scent of chalk dust. As the day drew towards noon, Mr. Edwards paused, glancing at the clock that ticked with a steady authority above the blackboard. He closed his book, clapped his hands lightly, and the children looked up, pens down. He said. The scratching stopped at once, silence filling the room except for the faint hiss of the radiators. For a moment, all that remained were the ink stains, the evidence of their morning's labor and the quiet satisfaction of words and numbers, now laid down across the page. And as the scrape of chairs began again, and the rumble of footsteps carried the children towards the dining hall, the ink pots sat waiting in their grooves, blue liquid glinting faintly in the sunlight, ready to tell yet another story when they returned. Little did they know, beyond the inky desks, the day still held moments of laughter, and clinking milk bottles, of playground shouts, and the freedom of damp pavements waiting at the school gates. The smell of boiled cabbage clung faintly to the corridors. But, as you pushed open the heavy doors of the dining hall, it was soon drowned out by something brighter, livelier, the rustle of paper packets, the crinkle of foil, the clink of glass milk bottles lined neatly in metal crates. It was the 1970s, and school lunches were as much a ritual as the morning assembly. Long wooden tables stretched the length of the room, worn smooth by years of elbows, scratched initials, and whispered secrets passed beneath them. The first sound was always chairs scraping as children hurried to claim their spots. Conversation spilled instantly into the air, half shouts, half laughter echoing beneath the high ceiling. From the teacher's table at the far end, there was the occasional clearing of a throat or pointed glance meant to restore order, but it never lasted. The dining hall had its own democracy, and it belonged to the children. Packed lunches were unwrapped with reverence, their contents treasures from home. A jam sandwich pressed flat by the weight of a school bag, cheese and pickle on white bread, cut into neat triangles by a mother's careful hand. For some, there were apples polished against jumpers, their skin glistening like polished conkers. For others, biscuits slipped into pockets from the family tin, custard creams or bourbons wrapped in scraps of wax paper. And then there were the milk bottles, their foiled tops waiting to be peeled back with cold fingers. In winter, the milk was often chilly, a shock against the tongue. But in summer, it could turn sour by midday, leaving a tang that lingered. The swapping began almost immediately. A jam tart for 2 biscuits, a packet of crisps for a slice of sausage roll. Negotiations were whispered fiercely, bargains struck under the table. The boy who never liked Marmite could always find a willing trader, and the girl with chocolate-covered digestives held power for at least 5 minutes. These tiny exchanges carried weight, shaping friendships, sparking rivalries, and sometimes ending in silent sulks when a deal went wrong. The noise of it all filled the space. The crackle of paper bags, the soft thud of milk bottles against wood, the squeak of shoes as children dashed from table to table. Somewhere in the background, cutlery clattered from the hot meal line, where trays of mince and mashed potatoes were being ladled out, the steam clouding the windows with a foggy glaze. The mingled smells, warm gravy, cheese sandwiches, Oranges being peeled created a heady mix that was unmistakably school. And yet, amid the chaos, there were quieter moments. A boy at the corner table slowly unwrapped his lunch, revealing nothing more than a single slice of bread spread thinly with margarine. He lowered his gaze as laughter rippled from nearby, but a girl across from him tore her biscuit in half and slid it across. She didn't say a word, only offered the smallest smile. He accepted, his shoulders lifting just slightly, a moment of kindness barely noticed in the sea of chatter. On the opposite side of the hall, a group of boys competed to see who could stack the most milk bottle tops into a shimmering tower, their laughter louder each time it collapsed. Others poked straws into the foil lids, blowing bubbles until the milk fizzed and spilt, earning disapproving glares from patrolling teachers. At one table, two friends huddled close, swapping the latest Beano comic, their sandwiches forgotten as they giggled over the mischief of Dennis the Menace. The walls of the hall carried everything, every shout, every giggle turning it into a blur of sound. The light through the tall windows cast stripes across the tables, catching on crumbs, half-eaten apples, a smear of jam left behind. The floor beneath, scuffed and marked by decades of shoes, carried its own history of lunches past. As the meal wound down, the energy shifted. Children began to tuck the last crusts back into bags, fold paper neatly or crumple it into balls to be tossed towards bins. Teachers announced the return to lessons with a clap or a bell, and groans rose like a wave. Chairs scraped back once more, footsteps echoed, and the hall slowly emptied. What remained were the smells, the temps of oranges, the lingering starch of mashed potatoes, the faint sweetness of chocolate wrappers and the scattered milk tops left behind on the tables. For the children, those lunches weren't just about food. They were about belonging, about the quiet thrill of trading something ordinary for something better, about the taste of home carried into the middle of a school day. They were about the small kindnesses, the half a biscuit shared, the extra crisp slipped into a friend's hand and the unspoken rules of playground economy. Years later, many would forget the exact sums they wrote in their ink-stained exercise books, or the lines of poetry they struggled to memorize. But the memory of those packed lunches, the crinkle of foil, the sharp sweetness of orange segments, the thrill of swapping a custard cream for a jam tart would remain, warm and vivid, a taste of childhood etched in time. And as the children shuffled back to their classrooms, the hall grew quiet again, only the echoes lingering beneath the beams. Yet, just beyond the doors, the day still held the sting of cold air on the playground, the thud of footballs against brick walls, and the laughter of children spilling into the afternoon. The first breath of air on the playing field always carried a different kind of chill, sharper, freer, laced with the scent of wet grass and distant chimney smoke. After the cramped heat of the dining hall, where foil crackled and milk bottles clinked against wood, the sudden rush into open space felt like stepping into another world. The noise changed too. Instead of the echoing roar of the hall, there was the wide open chorus of shouts and laughter, carried off by the wind across the field. It was a 1970s afternoon in an English school, when sports kits meant woolen socks sagging around ankles and heavy cotton shirts that clung damply after only a few minutes of running. The boys carried a leather football, worn smooth from years of use, its panels scuffed and darkened by mud. Just the sound of it being dropped onto the ground, the solid thud, was enough to stir excitement. The girls gathered near the far corner, divided into groups for rounders, their bats tucked under arms as they tied back hair with scraps of ribbon or elastic. The field was rough, not the manicured kind seen in glossy brochures. Patches of mud broke up the grass, puddles gathered after last night's drizzle, and the chalk lines marking the pitch were already fading. Yet none of that mattered. For the children spilling onto it, this was an arena, a stage, a place where the afternoon stretched endlessly ahead, promising both competition and laughter. A whistle blew, shrill against the sky, and the game began. Boots pounded the earth, the ball was kicked high into the air, and a scramble of bodies chased after it, their shouts colliding into a single roar. The wind carried the faint smell of damp soil, mixing with the woolen soap scent of school jumpers tossed onto the sidelines. Every fall onto the grass left trousers streaked, every header against the heavy leather ball left foreheads stinging, but no one minded. This was freedom in its purest form. At the edge of the pitch, a boy tied his shoelace too slowly, and when the ball rolled towards him, he lunged clumsily, sending it spinning in the wrong direction. Groans rose from his teammates, but almost instantly they were replaced with laughter. A girl watching from the sidelines, with arms folded, called out teasingly, "You're worse than Leeds United." A joke that earned a ripple of giggles, for in those days football loyalties ran deep and the latest First Division results were as familiar as the names of classmates. Further across the field, the Rounders game carried on in a rhythm of its own. The crack of the bat against the ball, the scuffle of shoes on damp earth, the triumphant shouts when someone made it past second base. At one point, the ball was lost briefly in the long grass near the hedge, and two girls bent to search for it, their laughter rising as they tried not to slip in the mud. One of them found it at last, holding it aloft like treasure, her fingers stained green with grass. Everywhere there was movement and sound, whistles blowing, children cheering, the dull clap of hands numbed by cold air, and yet within that chaos there were small, almost hidden moments. The boy who shared his scarf with a shivering teammate, the brief clasp of hands in congratulations after a well-timed kick, the teacher's encouraging nod from the sidelines, despite the stern exterior. By mid-afternoon, the field told its own story. Shoes were caked in mud, socks sagged even lower, knees grazed red where children had fallen hard. The air grew sharper still, the kind that prickled cheeks and left fingers stiff, but the games pressed on. There was always one last run to make, one last shot at goal, one last daring dash to the Rounders' base before the final whistle. When at last the whistle blew for real, sharp and final, a collective groan rose from the field. The game ended not with silence, but with laughter and playful complaints. With shoulders slung round friends, and voices still high with energy, the football, now heavier with damp, was tucked back under an arm. The bats were carried in a small cluster, their wooden handles chipped from years of use. Slowly, the tide of children began to move back towards the school, their chatter spilling over like birdsong. The walk back was its own kind of ritual. Boots squeaked with mud, leaving trails across the paving stones. Someone tried to kick the ball one last time and earned a half-hearted scolding from a teacher. A few lagged behind, heads tilted back to watch the clouds drifting low, the winter light turning them to bruised shades of grey and gold. Others ran ahead, eager for the warmth of the classroom radiators and the promise of afternoon lessons, though none would admit it aloud. As the doors closed behind them, the field stood quiet again, its grass torn and muddied, the echo of laughter lingering like the ghost of a cheer. For the children, though, the games were still alive, mud streaked across socks, the sting of grazes on their knees, the thrill of that last goal or missed catch playing over and over in their minds. And beyond the mud-stained kits and leather balls, the day was not yet done. The hum of lessons waited inside, the weight of homework still to come, and later. The slow drift towards pavements slick with drizzle and the comforting smell of chip shops glowing in the dusk. The first thing that hit you was the wind. It rushed across the open pitch, sharp and biting, carrying with it the damp scent of earth and the faint tang of coal smoke from houses that lined the far edge of the field. The ground was slick, the grass churned to mud in patches, but that didn't stop the children from scattering across it. Their laughter carried high into the grey afternoon. Woolen socks sagged at their ankles, thick with moisture, and heavy leather footballs thudded dully against boots, the sound echoing like a drum across the expanse. This was the 1970s, when games on the field were as much a part of school life as the ink-stained desks and chalk-dusted lessons indoors. The kits were plain cotton shirts that clung to damp skin, shorts that turned stiff with mud, but there was something timeless in the way play began. A whistle pierced the air, shrill against the winter sky, and suddenly the pitch came alive. Boys charged after the ball, their cries of "Pass it here," and "Over here," overlapping in a chorus of urgency. The ball itself, heavier than modern ones, seemed to resist the wind, landing with a satisfying thud each time it met boot or forehead. Every kick left mud spattering, clinging to socks and shins. Girls gathered further along, some engaged in rounders, their bats swinging sharp and decisive. Others huddled with scarves wrapped high, their cheeks pink from the cold. The teacher stood at the edge, coat buttoned tight, a whistle dangling from a string. He shouted encouragement, though often drowned out by the roar of voices. Every so often he clapped his hands, urging them on, his breath forming pale clouds in the frosty air. Not every child was bold in the melee. Some lingered at the edges, chasing half-heartedly, their eyes darting nervously each time the ball rolled near. But even they couldn't escape the thrill of being swept into play. The sudden rush of adrenaline when teammates shouted their names, the sting of cold air in their lungs. As they ran, the wild cheer when someone scored a goal, no matter how clumsy. One boy slipped spectacularly, landing flat in a puddle of mud. For a moment there was silence, then a burst of laughter that rolled across the pitch. He sat up, dripping and red-faced, but when his friend extended a hand to pull him up, their eyes met and both dissolved into laughter too. The game resumed as though nothing had happened. The boy's clothes plastered to his skin, but his grin wide and unbroken. The rounder's game had its own rhythm. The sharp crack of bat against ball, the scuffle of shoes on grass, the triumphant squeal as someone made it to base just before being caught. One girl slipped and skidded, tearing the knee of her tights, but she leaped up again, hair flying as she dashed forward, determined not to waste her chance. Her teammates cheered, stamping feet against the cold earth, their voices hoarse with encouragement. By mid-afternoon the light had changed. The sun, never strong, dipped behind a bank of low clouds, casting the field in shades of silver and grey. The chill deepened, fingertips tingled, and breaths came out in thicker clouds. Yet still the children played, unwilling to give in to the whistle that eventually sounded. When it did, long and final, a collective groan rippled through the air. They trudged from the field, boots caked with mud, socks clinging heavy around their ankles. Some dragged the ball along behind them, reluctant to leave it behind. Others pushed and shoved playfully, their cheeks flushed, their laughter unbroken. There was a camaraderie in the exhaustion, in the dirt on their legs, and the sting of fresh scrapes. As they made their way back towards the school gates, the pitch slowly emptied, the echo of their voices fading until only the quiet rustle of wind remained. The walk home had begun. The pavements glistened with drizzle, shining under the dull glow of street lamps flickering to life. Rows of terraced houses stretched out ahead, their front gardens edged with rotting fences, bicycles leaning against chipped brick walls. The air carried the smell of damp earth, mingled with something more tempting, the salty, comforting aroma of chips frying at the corner shop. Schoolbags swung against tired legs, buckles jangling. Children walked in groups, their chatter rolling like a low-tide snippets of the day replayed. Arguments over goals rehashed, plans for marbles or skipping ropes, tomorrow already forming. Some peeled away one by one, slipping down side streets towards warm homes, while others stretched the journey, dragging it out with dawdling steps and playful shoves. There were moments of stillness too. A boy walked alone, his boots scuffing the wet pavement, breath fogging as he watched it rise like smoke. A girl skipped ahead, her plaits swinging, singing softly to herself a tune she had heard on top of the pops. Somewhere a dog barked, its sound muffled by the fog settling in. For many, the walk home was the best part of the day. No teachers, no whistles, no ink stains or chalk dust. Just the fading light, the freedom of the street, and the anticipation of what waited at home, a coal fire crackling in the grate, a slice of bread and dripping, perhaps the hum of a black and white television warming up in the corner. As the last of the children disappeared into their own doorways, the streets grew quiet, lamplight pooling softly on the slick stone. Behind them, the school stood darkening, the field lying still, scarred with muddy footprints and the faint chalk lines of the games just played. And yet, even as the evening drew in, the day was not finished. Inside those houses, radios crackled to life, dinners simmered on tops, and the laughter from the field was replaced by new sounds, the clink of cutlery, the chatter of families, and the promise of tomorrow waiting just beyond the night. The school gates creaked open with their familiar groan, and suddenly the day spilled out onto the streets. Children burst through in little clusters, voices still bright with the energy of the field, though their socks sagged with mud and their shoes were caked from the pitch. School bags swung heavily from shoulders, straps digging into damp blazers, but none of them seemed to care. The air outside was sharp and cool, carrying the faint smell of drizzle on stone and the richer, saltier promise drifting from the corner chip shop just down the road. It was late afternoon in a 1970s English town, the kind of hour when the daylight was already beginning to fade, painting the world in soft greys and pale gold. The pavements glistened, still wet from the morning's rain, and the street lamps hummed faintly as they flickered to life, their halos glowing misty in the damp air. Rows of terraced houses stood shoulder to shoulder, bricks darkened by the weather, lace curtains drawn tight against the growing dusk. The children's footsteps rang out on the flagstones, a jumble of rhythm as some skipped ahead, others dawdled, dragging their feet as though to stretch the journey a little longer. Conversations overlapped complaints about homework, retellings of goals scored on the field, whispered secrets about who had swapped sandwiches at lunch. Laughter rose and fell like birdsong, echoing down the narrow street, before breaking apart as one child after another turned off towards their own front doors. For many, the walk home was the first real breath of freedom after a day of rules and whistles. There was no headmaster's booming voice here, no teacher's watchful eye, just the open street, the cool air, and the possibility of where the evening might lead. Some darted towards the chip shop, coins clutched in small fists, eager for a bag of hot chips wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, the vinegar sharp enough to sting their noses even before they tasted the first steaming bite. Others paused to kick a ball against a brick wall, its steady thud marking time as the drizzle began to soften into mist. There were small, unspoken rituals in the walk home. the boy who always swung on the lamppost at the corner, his blazer flaring out as he spun, before running to catch up. The pair of girls who shared an umbrella, even on days when the rain had stopped, their heads bent close together as they whispered and giggled. The boy who lived furthest away, always trailed by his younger brother, slowing his stride so the little one's shorter legs could keep pace. And there were quieter moments too. A child walking alone, tracing a finger along the cold iron railings, letting the sound of metal hum beneath their touch. Another pausing to peer into a shop window where televisions flickered, all tuned to the same channel, their black and white images casting ghostly light into the darkening street. From an upstairs window, a mother's voice called out, summoning her child in for tea, and he broke into a run school bag, bouncing wildly against his side. The smell of coal smoke drifted from chimneys, mixing with the sharper tang of petrol from a passing bus and the sweet, yeasty scent wafting from a bakery just as its shutters were being drawn down. These smells, chips, smoke, bread wove together into something unmistakably English. The background of countless walks home just like this. By now, the streets were beginning to quieten. The clatter of boots against stone softened as groups thinned out. One by one, children disappeared through gateposts, the slam of doors and the click of latches marking their arrival home. For those still walking, the dusk deepened, the street lamps glowing brighter against the pale mist, casting long shadows of swinging schoolbags on the pavement. Some lingered. A boy kicked at puddles, watching the ripples catch the lamplight. A girl paused to tie her shoelace beneath a dripping gutter, rainwater trickling past her onto the cobbles. Another child leaned against a wall, peeling back the foil on a leftover sandwich, chewing slowly as he looked at the glow of windows lighting up one by one along the row. There was no hurry, not yet. And yet, with each step, the world shifted from the school day to the evening ahead. Inside the houses, lights burned warm and steady. Curtains glowed softly, and the faint clatter of cutlery, the muffled sound of a radio playing the top 40, drifted into the street. The walk home was not just a journey of distance, but of transformation from pupil to child again, from uniformed discipline to the freedom of a familiar front door. For the children, this short passage of time carried a magic of its own. It was in the way the streetlights glistened on wet pavements, the way voices echoed longer in the emptying road, the way a bag of chips shared between two friends felt like a feast. It was in the hush that fell as each turned their corner, leaving behind the laughter of the group for the quieter sounds of home. By the time the last stragglers reached their gates, the drizzle had settled into a steady mist, soft against cheeks, dampening hair. The street seemed to exhale, its noises fading into the distant rumble of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. A final child ran the last few steps, schoolbag bouncing, before vanishing behind a heavy front door that clicked shut with finality. And then the street was still. The pavements, shining under the lamplight, held only the echoes of the day, the rhythm of swinging bags, the laughter trailing into the dusk, the faint memory of vinegar in the air. Tomorrow the school gates would open again, the voices would return, and the walk home would play out once more, with all its small rituals and fleeting freedoms. But for tonight, the terraced houses stood quiet, their windows glowing softly in the mist, keeping the warmth of family dinners and crackling fires hidden within. Outside, the air held on to the faintest trace of chips and damp stone, the very scent of an English childhood at dusk. And just beyond, the night stretched ahead, holding its own secrets, waiting for the next chapter to begin.